Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Well, despite the setback on account of the COVID-19 pandemic, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is hopeful that India can still achieve the 5 trillion economy target by 2024. In an interview to the Economic Times, Prime Minister Modi said India is on its way towards an economic recovery as shown by 5 indicators: record production and procurement in agriculture, record FDI inflows, demand resurgence as shown by growth in auto and tractor sales, improvement in manufacturing, and addition to the Employees Provident Fund Organization subscriber base, showing an improvement in the job market. On being questioned about the goods and services tax coming under considerable stress due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the fight against COVID-19 also got strengthened because of this approach. The Prime Minister went on to add that by all accounts, this has been an extraordinary year. Most assumptions and calculations did not take into account a once-in-a-century pandemic. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's path to recovery. Joining me on the program today are Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and Chairman, EGROW Foundation, Urmi Goswami of the Economic Times, and Abhinav Prakash, Assistant Professor, University of Delhi. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Dr. Virmani, I'd like to start the program with you. Let's first analyze the state of the Indian economy as it stands today.
So, the lockdown occurred in the last week of March and started getting lifted in early May. So basically for about 6 months, about 60% of the economy was under lockdown, and lockdown means it was basically closed. So if you look at it, literally there was zero production and sale from 60% of the economy. Of course, these are approximate, everything is not zero and so on, and that 60% is roughly defined, but that's what the situation was. So the question which everybody, so the first question was, how long will the lockdown effects last? Because from June, the lockdown started getting lifted, and one expected a recovery, but a lot of people became more and more pessimistic. And when I say people, I'm not talking about off the street, but well-informed analysts who were making, including IMF, World Bank, etc., who were making predictions of the world economy. So the first thing to understand was that lockdown meant certain parts of the economy, and we had done research and given what those parts were. And secondly, how quickly and partially the thing would normalize for this 60%. So the pessimism was, I think, overdone, as we had pointed out, and that pessimism is lifting. The recovery has been much faster than, I would say, 95 to 99% of the forecast I have seen, I have discussed in many forums, including before the RBI governor, where other people gave their forecast. And to the extent that the Prime Minister emphasizing that this part, that in Q2, which is basically July to September, the recovery has surprised, I would say, though we don't have the final Q2 numbers, it has surprised, I would say, 99% of analysts. And in that sense, I think PM is right to give a flag of confidence and positive encouragement to those who had become over pessimistic.
Right. Okay. Since we are here, then Urmi Goswami, let's talk about what the key indicators are suggesting and what is what are we getting out of them?
So the Prime Minister mentioned 5, indicators on which he bases, the green shoots in the fact that we are recovering faster. One is the record production and procurement, and we saw figures that even when the other parts of the economy, as Mr. Virmani mentioned, 60% of the economy, which was under lockdown or had come to a standstill, agriculture wasn't among them, and we saw that even in those figures of the earlier set of figures, we could see agriculture functioning. So we now see record production and record purchase. Then the more interesting metric here is the FDI flows, which is about 36 billion between April and August. And this is higher, about 13% higher than the same period last year. So clearly, there is something that itself is an indicator of of positivity. And auto sales again, and tractor sales, which you all mentioned, and which the Prime Minister mentioned, and which you also referred to earlier. Now, those clearly show demand. The fact that EPFO enrollment is up again shows employment. At least in the formal sector. Does that? But again, all this is good, but it has to be sustained. I think that is where the focus is, because the critics already began to say that this is just one set of one. We are basing ourselves on one what we are seeing now in September. So we need to what we see are the roots of something that can be sustained. Now we have to ensure that this is sustained. I think that's where the criticality comes in, at least from
Right.
the metrics that the Prime Minister is saying. Of course, I would venture to say that there is more that can be done, and that comes from much more critical signals that need to come from government. Because if you look at the world today, we have seen in the past, a month and a half, or a little more, actually about a month, announcements of countries talking about having net emissions. That means no carbon emission, no GHG emissions by 2050. Now,
Sure.
that's not just a climate change or environmental issue. That's a very clear economic indicator saying this is where we are going. And I think that's how we are going to get our investments. That is, I think, where we should be focusing, because that $5 trillion economy that the Prime Minister is speaking about will require huge amounts of investments, and huge amounts of investments will come when we show that we are taking the risks of climate change, biodiversity loss, which is at the core of the current crisis. I mean, we can't forget that. We can't forget
Sure.
why we landed where we have. So I think, yes, these metrics are important, and they tell us that it's the green shoots of recovery are there, and the things are not as bad as we imagine them to be, but you want them to be better. I think there needs to be much more that needs to be done in that direction, the signals that you send out.
Absolutely. What more needs to be done? We'll get into that in just a bit. But Abhinav, Prakash, let's talk about the resilience of rural India yet again. We've seen that rural India has come to the fore, and the recovery seems to be stemming from there.
Yes, Frank. As we know that the agricultural sector was the only sector which was opened up the first. So there was not a strict lockdown in the agricultural sector like the one we have seen in the urban sector and the industrial sector. So the production went on in the rural sector, and we are seeing the impact. And it's also the combined impact of the different policies of the government so far. So the production, the agricultural production is at a record high level. And the procurement of the agricultural produce by the government is also at a very record level. So in that sense, that is creating a positive impact at the ground level, so that the incomes will be higher in the villages and in the agricultural sector, which will drive up the rural consumption, and which is going to provide some support to the expected contraction in the GDP otherwise. But when you're talking about the resilience, there are certain points which the Prime Minister has pointed out and which are very important. The first thing is pointed out is regarding the work done to build the state capacity in the last 6 years, in the form of the DBT, in the form of the Aadhaar, in the form of the digital India. So that has come to the rescue this time. You see, not just in the distribution of the aid to the people, but also in monitoring and implementation of different government policies. Also, if you see at the rural sector, and we also see at the farm reforms which have been done, the farm bills reform, the 3 bills which have come out, which also gels very well into what the Prime Minister has said, that this new India, or the India today, believes in the market. It is not about, this India is not about the old India, which was more towards the government sector, or that kind of a My Baap Sarkar sector. The India believes in the market. India believes in the trade and openness and globalization. So if we see this agricultural performance, when we couple that with the farms bill, the reform in the agricultural sector, and also with the policy thrust which Prime Minister has indicated going forward, that we're going to open up even more, I think we are going to see a substantial increase in the productivity and the incomes in the villages, rural sectors.
Right. Okay. Since we're talking about globalization, Dr. Virmani, do you believe that this could be a concern area? You know, number of cases going up in Europe, in the US, people calling for lockdowns, governments going into lockdown now in Europe, and you know the number of cases going up in the US as well. That could be the situation in a few weeks. So, is that going to be a concern area?
So let me put this in a broader context, which is the overall policy change or thrust, which has come in what I guess for simplicity one can call Modi 2 government, you know, a second term of the Modi government. And this concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is directly related to your question. So here I think what the PM has tried to do is to emphasize this. This is something I have been tweeting about for some time and writing about, and will be giving a talk in a couple of days. But I think it was important. Again, this is the second point I want to make. I've already made one important, which he had made. The second is that he has tried to put this in the policy, you know, generally to put the framework out there. He has talked about the market-oriented policies in the Modi 2 government, because a lot of people who were expecting reforms in the Modi 1 government were disappointed. And I would say genuinely disappointed because they had thought there would be big reforms during the Modi government. Not that there were no reform, but there were also things which one, from a purely economic perspective, could be considered the opposite of reform. So I think what he has clarified is this is a clear, conscious direction from whatever little I have read from the article to make it into a market-oriented policy framework. So I would emphasize that for the general reader, and especially, and second, he's tried to explain this Atmanirbhar, which is the self-confidence. I think Mr. Abhinav referred to the reforms for agriculture. You know, agriculturalists are not children. They are not idiots. They are not fools. So the confidence has to be all across the board. Confidence is not just for the corporate sector, but agriculturists. You know, what they need is help. They don't need to be treated like children. So this whole issue of giving them better options, more options, competitive sale of their product, etc. So the reform orientation. Agriculture is just one example. There are several other examples we can discuss and what is pending. But I think that's very important to emphasize that he has now come on publicly to try and explain that there is a change in framework and that it is based on confidence. It is not a protectionist thing. So there will be some elements of temporary higher tariffs, etc. Everybody, all countries in the world are doing it. You know, this question of fair trade, free trade versus fair trade will be there. But we will do it confidently. We will supply the world. We will participate in global supply chains, etc. And that will be ensured by all these reforms, which we can discuss in detail if you have the time later.
Absolutely. All right. So, Urmi, let me bring you in now. So, as far as the goal of reaching $5 trillion economy by 2024, are we on track? What needs to be done? What are the things that we need to watch out for?
Okay, so before I set off on that, is another little piece of reform that we tend to leave out because it's not strictly in the economic domain, is the new education policy. That's critical because human capital is critical to this new economy that this $5 trillion economy that we are talking about. Are we on track? That's a very good question. In terms of, do we have the thinking that will get us there? Now we are talking there. Some of the blocks, like if you look at the Farm Bill, if you look at the labor reforms, these are all building blocks that will take us to that $5 trillion economy. But as I mentioned, the biggest signal that we need to put out there is to say that we acknowledge in our economic planning the biggest risk that humanity faces today. And it's a risk that the Prime Minister not only recognizes, but he has listed as one of the biggest threats facing humanity. And that's climate change and biodiversity loss. Now, this is not about, touchy-feely green environmental talk. This is about orienting your economy in such a manner that we are a lower waste economy, So we are talking about resource efficiency. If you look at the numbers, resource efficiency can actually, what will it actually mean? It will mean that we'll use less resource to build more. So more for less. Now, does that remind you of something? That reminds you of what the Prime Minister said, zero effect, zero defect, more for less. He used that term more for less in terms of irrigation. It's that taken to every resource you can think of. If we use our resources for longer, we use them for better, we actually pollute less. And if you're think about the impact poor air quality has on productivity. So yes, can we do a $5 trillion economy? Yes, but we need to enable ourselves to do that $5 trillion economy. We have to, for what does that mean? That means creating the conditions through regulation. The government has taken many of those big steps. The farm laws reforms are one, labor is one. The labor reform is huge. It's kind of brought in like more than 100 sort of regulations and brought them together, rationalized it. What is more important is that you have been able to do away with that artificial of the divide between organized and unorganized. So you are looking at labor as labor. So that's one of the big things. That's important. The farm bill is another one. Now you have to look at the other enablers. And one of them is telling the financial community, the investor community, that we are alive to the biggest risk and we are building our policies with that risk in mind. And I think that is critical. That I think is what that will see a lot of investment come in. And India has that benefit. 70% of our infrastructure is yet to be built. So if we send out the right signal, we will have that kind of investment coming in, because it's not about retrofitting old systems. It's about creating new ones.
Absolutely.
So I think, yes, it is possible.
Okay, so it's possible. We just need to do a little bit of fine-tuning. We need to improve the ecosystem as a whole, bring in those regulations, bring in those reforms, and we can see our economy reaching 5 trillion mark by 2024 is what Urmi is suggesting. So Abhinav, let me come across to you now. So what are the challenges really that you foresee over the next 4 years or so? How do we address them? What is the immediate issue that needs to be addressed? What needs to be looked at in the long term?
Well, that's a very important question, but the scope is very wide, so I'll confine myself to 1 or 2 points, Frank. We are seeing a V-shaped recovery after this lockdown has ended, but we also need to remember that the recovery is slowing down every month. So I think it was more of a reflection of the pent-up demand, that we saw up until now. Going forward, it will require, we will face more challenges in order to sustain this recovery, as other panelists have also talked about. One thing we have to be very clear about, that the modern economic growth rate will ultimately come from your urban centers. Now, the agriculture sector is doing good as of now. It is being able to sustain some, GDP in this year. But going forward, the productivity growth rate depends very critically on the technology. And is the cities and is the urban center which produce technology. So we need to invest massively in the cities and the urban centers of India, which we have not been doing so far. For the past 70 years, the cities have been the sideshow in the overall political power and the focus of the economic policies. Now, the Prime Minister has talked about cooperative federalism. So he's emphasizing federalism, he's talking about GST, about different policies, agriculture, and so on. But we need to make sure that this federalism is not just between the center and the state. We need to go to the third level, that is our urban centers. So urban reform, I see, is going to be the way forward to make our cities livable, to make them center of technological growth, center of knowledge production, because technology drives the modern economic growth rate. It can no longer come from the old ways of production processes which have been going on, especially with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, which is already making an impact across the world. Also, we need to, as I say, which Prime Minister has also talked about, we need to augment the state capacity. The Indian state is too small in actual size. We do not have enough police officers. We do not have judges. Around 40% vacancies in the high courts. This is unbelievable when you have millions of cases which are pending in the court. We don't have people to man our administrative departments. And most of it falls under the purview of the state governments. So the state capacity needs to be augmented in India. We have to do simultaneously administrative reforms because we don't want more of the same. We don't want more of the same bureaucracy, but the numbers of the people employed in the service delivery, in the frontline bureaucracy needs to be augmented in order to make sure that the government policies are implemented and we have a better grip of the things. Third and the final point, which Urmi ji has already talked about, is regarding the education, Frank. Remember, the technology and the skills, they're not about machine, they are about the people. And we need to invest in our people. And without the educational reforms, we can't move forward. I'm coming from Delhi University. I'm seeing the admission process, the kind of marks students are getting, 100 out of 100 in English, maths, philosophy, and everything. I think we need to do something about it. We cannot take forward this human resource in order to in order to build a new India or the new economic structures that we talk about. I think I will confine myself to these 3 points. Otherwise, there are many more points to discuss.
Absolutely. I think these are very valid points that you have raised, very valid 3 points, short and sweet, I think, but conveyed a lot of information there. All right. Time to get closing comments now with the best way forward. Dr. Virmani, the floor is yours.
Basically, one or two simple facts for the short term, because it's very important. You know, if we look at the latest unemployment rate from CMIE, which is available for September, that rate is less than it was in September 2019. So if you look at the rate by itself, we are already normalized, but that's not the full story. And that's the important thing for policy. The labor force participation rate is about 2% point lower than it was last year. So what does that tell us? That tells us that people are not participating because they are afraid of the pandemic. So it is very important. And again, this actually points to another speech which he gave, PM gave, I think a week or so ago, that we must follow precautions. There is no other way to get rid of fear till there is a cure or a vaccine, which is going to take at least 6 to 9 months, except for following the basic principles, which are now kind of understood. It's just that everybody has to adopt them. So there is no other way, in my view. The economic data doesn't show me any other way except to do that for the services and certain other things. Now, having said that, there are a number of things, and I'll go very quickly through it. One is GST simplification, which is, the GST is 60% complete, but it is just too complex for MSMEs. So we have to proceed on that. Unfortunately, because of this conflict between state, this may be delayed a little bit, but I think we should come back to it because it will affect states the most, because that's where the MSMEs are. The second is the direct tax code. There are two things. One, which has been known for ages, it's a terribly complex. It's probably the most complex code in the world. And the second is the maximum marginal rate is now too high. It doesn't even maximize revenues. In corporate tax, we had shown, I had not shown, but others had, that beyond 25%, the revenue actually goes down in the long term. So similar thing now, a marginal rate is too high. So rationalization of the direct tax code and reducing the maximum marginal rate. And third is direct cash. We have to now start moving from DBT to DCT, okay? Because this is what, in a pandemic, in places where you have selective, where you have migrants getting into trouble, you have little pockets of stuff, you've got to have a system where you can target and identify. And we have the structure of the system, we just got to complete it. So that is the third. Very quickly, the fourth one, external trade, because of the opportunity of supply chains and value chains, all this thing about US, China, etc. But to make full use of the opportunity, we've got to make sure that the EODB in external trade, which is very high, ease is low, the index is bad. So we need to do that. Finally, regulations, decriminalization, government has done it, but it needs to complete that.
Right.
Digitization, it's doing all those things. And also it can experiment. It cannot affect the states, but it can experiment in special economic zones and UTs. It could put a model system into place. And of course, financial sector reform, which is wide-ranging and continuing, there are elements of that also need to be pursued.
Absolutely. Very quickly, I've got limited time on the program. Urmi, best way forward?
Sorry. Keep with the reforms that you're doing, because India has this thing of, we have to fix certain structural problems of the past, we have to grow, and we have to grow right. So you have to do all those three things. So keep with the reforms. send out the right signals that we are not just looking at building back, but we are looking at building forward. We are looking at building for a new economy which is resilient, which is sustainable, and which recognizes the problems that led us to this place where we are now. We cannot at any point forget that the current pandemic is the result of a linear economy which paid no regard to nature, to biodiversity loss or climate change. So if we have to mainstream that idea in our conversation and in our economic planning. So yes, you have to reform for the structural faults of the past. You have to show that you're alive to the risks of the future, and you are planning for that. And the other third part of which the Prime Minister himself addressed, is the significance of the delivery mechanisms. That needs to be deepened. It's not just about the factors he mentioned. The reforms that you're doing now, the reforms in farm reform, the labor reforms, that has to get implemented and reflected at the ground. And that's a huge problem, because there are a lot of vested interests that will try to derail this implementation. So if we can fire on all three cylinders, we are set.
And Abhinav, Prakash, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think going forward, we need to focus on resolving the NPA issue and strengthen the banking system. Second point is that judicial reforms are a must. They cannot be delayed anymore, in my opinion. They should be the next second generation reform. And final point, as Urmi ji was also talking about, we need to improve our delivery mechanism. For that, we need to have a proper database of our population. So NPR needs to be accelerated so that we do not face with the same problem that how many migrant workers are stuck in different parts of the country. So a proper census, proper database of the population is something which will build the state capacity in the coming years. Thank you.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that we have certainly seen green shoots in the economy, and signs and indicators are positive. The increasing cases of COVID-19 around the world are a serious concern, but we seem to be insulated to some extent due to rural demand and Atmanirbhar Bharat. We can reach our goal of being a $5 trillion economy by 2024, but a lot has to be done between now and then. We need to have proper regulation, also undertake large-scale reforms, and create a conducive ecosystem. What we need is better implementation of government schemes, a better delivery mechanism system, and also we need to improve our human capital and infrastructure. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.